Objectives: students able to learn the historical background of social psychology, to identify the philosopher's different perspective regarding on this practice. Students able to learn the fundamental arguments between philosophers. Gordon Allport nominated Auguste Comte as the founder of social psychology as a science. In fact, sociology did not really exist, but Comte saw it coming. Comte called this science la morale positive, but it was clearly psychology. Psychology has a history before and after Comte, but it is interesting to know that when it was first conceptualized as a discipline, it was seen as being the ultimate one. If not with Comte, where does social psychology begin? Clearly, ancient philosophers pondered the inherent nature of humankind, the way people interact and influence each other, and the way they govern themselves. In the Republic, Plato argued that men organize themselves and form governments because they cannot achieve all their goals as individuals. In 1954, in his classic chapter on the historical background of modern social psychology, Gordon Allport nominated Auguste Comte as the founder of social psychology as a science. He noted that Comte, the French philosopher and founder of positivism, had previously in 1839 identified sociology as a separate discipline. In fact, sociology did not really exist, but Comte saw it coming. Allport noted that one might say that Comte christened sociology many years before it was born. As on many other issues, Plato's younger colleague Aristotle had a different view. He held that people came together and organized groups from intellectual tendencies toward sociability rather than utilitarian needs for a social contract. Aristotle based his judgments on data as he understood them. His idea that people naturally came together and that they could be trusted to use their verifying talents to create the good society was based on a more generous view of human nature than Plato's. Nearly 2,000 years later, these issues became matter of sharp debate during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. The emergence of psychology. Plato's and Aristotle's fundamental arguments about the nature of human beings, especially as they related to ideas about the best form of social organization and government, continued for centuries. Alongside these debates were other philosophical inquiries also tracing back to the ancients, particularly Socrates and Aristotle, about many other aspects of human condition. People studied medicine, astronomy, mathematics, physics, chemistry, and sociology, again with roots dating back to the Greeks beyond. When philosophers and scientists both began to tackle the same question in the late 19th century, the true final science of psychology emerged. Psychology blossomed under the leadership of James and Stanley, who founded the first formal American psychological laboratory at Johns Hopkins University in 1883. In 1890, James published his classic two-volume Principles of Psychology, followed in 1892 by a briefer course version of same work. He wrote on such topics as sensation, vision, hearing, habit, the brain and neural activity, the self, and the will.
In the year 1895, the birth of social psychology. In this year, Norman Triplet began studies of how social processes affect bicycle racing, and Gustave Le Bon published his analysis in the year 1896 about the group behavior in psychology this follies. And while Floyd Allport coined the term social facilitation to refer the phenomenon of enhanced performance by the presence of others. Gustave Le Bon argued that in crowd people are highly suggestible and can be led easily by emotion appeals of leaders, and Mark Antony's manipulation of the crowd in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar provides a powerful example of a leader manipulating the extreme emotions of a crowd. He relied heavily on notions of contagion and suggestion, and in the year 1921, they figured prominently in Freud's volume on group behavior and have influenced subsequent work on groupthink, the individuation, and leadership.
The 20th century. The general development of psychology, fostered in great part by G. Stanley Hall, brought social psychology along with it. But the field of sociology also contributed the emergence of social psychology, just as Comte has foreseen. Le Bon's work has perhaps more influential among sociologists and informed important turn of the century work by Charles Horton Cooley, whose book Human Nature and the Social Order 1902 developed the idea of imitation, a concept closely related to Le Bon's concept suggestion. Imitation is more concerned with behavior, suggestion with thought and recognition. In 1908, sociological and psychologically oriented treatments of social psychology were represented in two textbooks that contained the phrase social psychology in their titles. E. A. Rowe's social psychology, like Cooley's book, emphasized the ideas of suggestion or imitation. Rowe's ideas were applied especially to issues such as crowd, social movements, social class, marriage, and religion. Pipitone, 1999.
During 1937, Murphy identified with hundreds of studies importance in understanding the evolution of psychology. The study of social influence was a key line of work in the pre-World War II decades. 1921, H.T. Mori demonstrated the influence of a reported majority of peers and expert participants' preference between the two musical, ethical, and linguistic options. Mori found judgment were very frequently reversed in response to either kind or influence, particularly majority influence. T. Mori find made sense. Alport argued that the opinions of others served as a stimuli that elicit a confirming response. These interpretations resonated with Rowe's earlier emphasis on suggestion and imitation, and the view of philosophers who had been pointing for many years to human irrationally. During 1936, Lurch was published the highlighted of impact of prestige and suggestion. He asked student reaction to statement that little rebellion now and then is a good thing. The statement was attributed to either more likely to agree with the statement when attributed to Jefferson. To devise norms and that people take established norms into the new entrance and to adapt those norms. And that people take established norms into new groups. 1930s, importantly, studies of interpersonal influence were conducted the impact of group in individuals. In 1931, Kurt Lewin, the first was conducted by Kurt Lewin and his colleagues, was inspired by Lewin's experience as a refuge from Nazi Germany. Kurt Lewin is also a giant in the history of social psychology. Started at publishing his work in Germany and made major contributions to the understanding personality, child development, learning memory, and perception. 1933, Lewin came to US during the first year of Hitler reach in Germany. He left the prestigious psychological institution Berlin of the Department of Home Economics of Cornell. He took the appointment of Lua Child Welfare Research Station, conducted a social climate and behavior in group club composed of groups of 11-year-old boys who were supervised by adults who adopt one of three leadership style. Una is a democratic and autocratic. Then the last one is Mauni ang laissez-faire. In 43, Theodore Newcomb at Bennington College in 1930s had his social relevance but dealt with personal question of the nature of social norms and social influence. 1930s, newly founded Bennington College, an undergraduate school for women, was an intervisiting mix of mostly liberal faculty and list when the young women first enrolled. World War II and the studies of group dynamics, attitudes, and person perception research by Sheriff in group norms, and Lewin and his colleagues on leadership show that social psychology was alive to important social issues. Once the USA was drawn into World War II, social psychologists became engaged in question promoted by the need of mobilize the nation for a long conflict. So Kurt Lewin again was the forefront. He was asked by National Research Council to study ways of persuading women homemakers to serve animal viscera, heart, sweetbreads, and kidneys to their families. Lewin continued to be interested in group forces and reasoned that influence through group norms would be more influential and more lasting than influence produced by a persuasive message presented in a lecture. Lewin, 1943, and later researchers Bennett, 1955, Radke, and Klisorich, 1947, found that change in attitudes and behavioral commitment produced by perception of groups norms were in fact the most dramatic. Came to the US from Hamburg, Germany in 1930, teaching for a time at Smith College and then moving the University of Kansas in 1947. Heder was a major figure in the tradition of Gestalt psychology, a perspective that emphasized cognitive and perceptual organization. The term Gestalt comes from the German and means shape of form. Gestalt psychology such as Kofla, Kohler, and Wertheimer emphasize the very proactive way people process information and organize perceptual elements into a coherent wholes, particularly wholes that have good fit and are a blessing. Kofla, 1935.
Fissinger published an important theoretical paper in formal social communication. He argued that the need to define the social reality or to achieve group locomotion created pressures toward uniformity of opinion within groups. The pressure would be observed in informal social communication or talk among group members and would tend to produce a great deal of research that he conducted with colleagues such as Gerard Hemovich, Kelly, Raven, and Scotcher. A self-presentation account argued that people need only to appear consistent, not feel consistent. And more recent self-affirmation theory, still 1988, holds that people simply need to affirm that they are good rather than feel consistent. A great deal of research on when and why self-justification attitude change takes place has kept the cognitive dissonance tradition alive and well.
The 1960s, the return of social influence. Thanks in a part to the impact of Leon Fistinger's own changes in direction, social influence and group dynamics research resided in prominence immediately after World War II. One extremely important exemption was the work of Solomon Asch on the prestige, influence, and conformity. As noted above, Asch was influenced by Gestalt principles in 1948. He took on the studies by Moore and Lord from the 19th and 1930s. Arguing that people were not thoughtlessly influenced by majority or expert opinion. In the late 1940s, Asch also began his extremely important and influential studies of conformity. Ash 1951 asked naive research participants to make judgment about the length of lines when an anonymous majority of their peers made obviously erroneous judgment about the lines in face-to-face situation. One of the most important distinctions in the literature is the one between compliance and internalization. That is simply going along with social pressure without believing what one is saying as opposed to actually coming into belief that others are correct. Herbert Killman importantly added the conceptual overview by suggesting that identification should be set alongside compliance and internalization as a process of opinion change. Sometimes, people come to believe something because they identify with an attractive source. They do not fully internalize the opinion into their belief and value system but hold it so long as they are trying to be like an attractive communicator. Reintroducing the identification bring back one of the original explanations in Libons and Frauds on 1921. Account of leadership and group behavior. Issues of conformity and blind social influence were put into sharp relief in the early 1960s by Stanley Milgrams. Well-known study of obedience to authority. Adult and other students, research participants were drawn from the New Haven, Connecticut area. It may be that participants' inability to articulate reasons for disobeying are an important element in producing obedience. Psychologists feel that they may have a chilling impact elements of the whole research enterprise. One of the arguments psychologists have made in requesting latitude in the producers they use to conduct research as they must recreate situations of high impact in order to study important phenomena. A compelling example of the study of behavior in high-impact situations is the research on bystanding intervention in emergencies or helping behavior initiative by John Darley and Bibb Latin in 1960s. Darley and Latin were inspired by the famous case in 1964 of Katie Genovese in New York City, where 38 bystanders watched while Genovese was stabbed repeatedly and eventually killed in an incident that unfolded over a half an hour. They suggested a 5-step model whereby intervening was dependent on noticing the emergency, interpreting it as a situation where help was needed, accepting responsibility for intervening oneself, knowing the appropriate form of assistance, and finally taking action. Studies suggested that misinterpretation and diffusion of responsibility were important variables in affecting people's behavior in such situation. Importantly, the presence of more than one observer dramatically increased the chances of both those variables decreasing the rate of helping. Research by Jean and Irving Gliabin in the 1972 approach helping behavior in terms of reward and cost once again bring a reinforcement perspective to social psychology. Originally, focusing on both the reward and cost of both helping and not helping in various situations, the model evolved towards putting more emphasis on the cost of each course of action, especially high. Miller 1985. Similarly, questions of cooperation and competition, and more generally social justice are alive and well present, largely due to influential work in the 1960s by Diost and Cross on threat and cooperation and learned people's belief in a just world. Morton was heavily influenced by his mentor, Kurt Lewin, and productively explored conflict, cooperation, and competition for much of his career. Melvin Lerner's work on justice helped nurture and develop a tradition of concern with relative deprivation and social justice that had begun with the pioneering more on the 1940s and 1950s of Herbert Hyman. On Status and Reference Group, Samuel Stopper and his colleagues on experience of the American soldier, reference group and relative deprivation, tendencies to take more risks that could be expected from the risk-taking propensities of the members of the group.
In 1970s, the rise of attribution theories. Social group work has been brought to the fore as out-of-school youth, behavioral and social problems, disabled and disadvantaged persons increased in 1970s. For a while, cases of poverty also increased. Family and child orientation was the main focus to aid such heavy caseloads and funds
was set aside not only for the basic needs to supply, but vocational training was also included to sustain their needs. Tools and equipment like sewing machines, educational aid, capital loans or grants in aid for livelihood projects, supplemental feeding for preschool children are some of the programs. Material assistance did not automatically solve the problems as recognized by the local practitioners. Emotional and psychological problems was found due to addiction of youth and adult, child neglect, abuse and exploitation, marital conflict, and broken homes are some of the reasons that caused psychological dysfunctioning that was observed during 1980s that inspired them to strengthen and enrich the renewal of casework practice.
Developments in social psychology and the future. It is difficult to anticipate what is the lasting importance from the social psychology of the last decade of millennium and what trends will remain most vigorous in the new country. A number of lines of work seen particularly energetic and creative. First, there has been an explosion of interesting work in the self, beginning perhaps with question of self of social comparison processes. Second, research on theory, prejudice, and stereotypes seem particularly vigorous in this writing, supported by advance in social cognition and by a greater understanding of cognitive and motivational elements of intergroup conflict and ethnic hostility. Research on stereotypes and prejudice has mushroomed. The work on stereotypes has been greatly influenced by a third development, namely methodological and conceptual advances in the study of automatic information processing and responding. Fourth, there has been a recent and somewhat controversial body of work on evolutionary influence on social behaviors. Fifth, there has also been a good deal of recent work on cultural differences in fundamental social psychological processes, with particular emphasis on difference between Western and Eastern societies.
Summary. In reviewing the development of social psychology over the past 100 years or more, we are struck with the tremendous gain in knowledge combined with the intractability of the basic questions of human nature. We have learned a great deal about how people respond to social influence, about group dynamics and intergroup relations, and about social thought. Further nuances of social behavior will be discovered, and the power of our thinking and methodologies will continue to generate new findings and continue to fascinate. However, basic questions such as whether we should be more impressed with the shortcoming or the capacities of human social thought will almost certainly remain unanswered, but the hunt for answers itself will engage us all and enlighten us and perhaps uplift us for, if we are lucky, another 100 years.